Well, hello and welcome to Receptive Ecumenism, the role of the Spirit in new ecumenical endeavors. And so my name is Nathan Smith. I'm the Director of Ecumenism for Glenmary Home Missioners. And on behalf of Glenmary, I want to thank you for joining us on this important discussion. It is my hope that this will not be simply a time of a one-way lecture. In fact, it's designed to do just the opposite. And that through these ideas, along with Dr. Murray's lecture, in your own self-reflection, you may, through the Spirit of God, find new avenues of deeper unity amongst Christians and with Christ as well. As a point of detail, I do want to ask that all of you remain muted until called upon as to provide just a clear listening experience for the group. We're going to have two separate occasions for Q&A following different sections of Paul's talk. So to ask a question, once we get to that, I'll just ask that you write it in the chat and I'll read through that, either read that straight to Paul or if it needs further elaboration, we'll invite you to unmute and to share that directly. And please note that Paul's lecture will also be recorded and then I'll share the link for that on whatever appropriate platform I later find for that. And finally, as a point of introduction, and not to take anything away from Paul's prepared lecture, I want to note the question that really drives receptive ecumenism. That is, what in any given situation can one's own tradition appropriately learn with integrity from other traditions? And this raises many questions regarding what we learn and what does reception with integrity look like? And most importantly, I think, how reception of this learning deepens our connection with our ecumenical partner and with Christ. And so as you listen to this lecture, I want to invite you just to consider this question continually and to allow this concept to shape your own questions in some way. And my hope is that by the end of our time today, you will not leave with simply a new idea, but may be open to experience Christ in the pilgrim journey of holiness and of unity. And on a personal note, being an evangelical myself who has entered into full communion with the Catholic Church, I'm really indebted to Paul and this notion of receptive ecumenism. It's really in this frame that I was invited in a theologically robust way to understand my experience, not of jettisoning of my past tradition, my experience of Christ, but an affirmation of where I've been, a deepening of where I am now, and I hope a continued maturation into the likeness of Christ as his body, the church, with eyes to see and ears to hear how the Spirit is at work within the broader Christian tradition, which invites us ever deeper into union with Christ and to others. And now for my introduction here to Dr. Murray. I'm deeply honored to do this and have you join us today. Paul, Dr. Murray is the professor of systematic theology and dean director of the Center for Catholic Studies at Durham University. The CCS is the UK's first permanent center devoted to pioneering research, teaching, and outreach in Catholic theology in the Public Academy, and is the international center of many of the research initiatives on receptive ecumenism. He's the author of and editor of many books and essays, including Receptive Ecumenism and the Called Catholic Learning, Exploring a Way for Contemporary Ecumenism from Oxford Press, and his forthcoming monograph provisionally entitled Healing the Wounds of the Church, Theology and Practice of Receptive Ecumenism. And Paul's also served in the editorial board of Concilium International, and in 2011 was appointed by Pope Benedict XVI to the third phase of work of the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission. So again, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And Paul, I want to hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Nathan, and good afternoon, everybody. Such gracious words of introduction. They almost inevitably build me up for a fall and you all for a disappointment. So let us then, appropriately mindful of limits and constraints, let us hope and pray that the Spirit can so move my listening, thinking, being, and speaking during our time together, as also your own listening, thinking, being, and speaking, that something at least of worth, something of the Spirit's moving, of our moving, can actually come to pass. I thank each of you for your interest in this topic, and only regret that we're not able to explore it together in person, face to face. On behalf of us all, I think you will appreciate me thanking you, Nathan, for conceiving and organising all aspects of this event in your dual capacity as Director of Ecumenism at Glenmary and as Field Representative for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And similarly, I thank Glenmary Home Missioners for making all of this possible and for hosting us this morning, or if you're on our side of the pond, this afternoon. I'm mindful that while some of you are likely coming to Receptive Ecumenism fresh, others are coming with an engagement that already stretches over quite some years. So what I've tried to put together is something that will both introduce and extend, and it will take as its departure that very helpful focus that Nathan gave us on the key question. There are 4 points that I'm going to explore with the group this afternoon. These are firstly, the distinctiveness and limits of receptive ecumenism. And under that heading, I'll explore how receptive ecumenism is to be understood relative to other ecumenical approaches. The second key point I'll reflect on is receptive ecumenism as a movement of the Spirit. And under that, I'll reflect on something of the pneumatological basis for and related pneumatological dimensions of receptive ecumenism. The third thing we're going to spend some time reflecting on is receptive ecumenism and Catholic evangelical and Catholic Pentecostal engagement. Under that, as it says on the tin, I'll explore some of the ways, I'll touch on rather than explore some of the ways in which receptive ecumenism has already featured in Catholic evangelical and Catholic Pentecostal engagement. And then final key point, receptive ecumenism in the lives of local churches, where we'll identify some of the ways in which receptive ecumenism has been engaged at the level of local church life. Now, my exploration of the first 2 points is a little more extended than my initial opening up of the last 2 points. And in conversation and planning with Nathan, we've decided that the most appropriate thing is to divide the input and discussion into 2 sections. The first will deal with the first 2 points that I've just outlined, and that will really be offering some fundamental theological principles and orientations for receptive ecumenism. So they kind of hang together quite nicely and will make a nice, hopefully will make a nice block to stimulate some conversation. And then the second part of our time together, we'll deal with the third and fourth points, where we'll turn to open up some of the practical work that is to be done. And having opened up these more practical points, I'll close really by returning to where we start out with the distinctiveness and limits of receptive ecumenism, and by reminding us that receptive ecumenism is not all there is. It has its distinctive role to play, but its role is not everything. And if the enthusiasm of rhetoric has sometimes given another impression than that, then I apologize and step back, because we're not claiming it's everything and for all situations. And that will kind of neatly emphasize the way in which things are inevitably pushed back onto you as active participants, by inviting each of you to reflect on what, if any, contribution receptive ecumenism might actually be able to make in your own specific context and in the domains for which you have some direct responsibility. I've got this basic theory that we can kind of get down by looking always at the big picture and wondering how on earth we're going to sort the entire big picture out. In the history of human race, we've no generation, no individual on anything has ever had to sort the whole big picture out. What we've kind of got to do is open the back door and look at our own backyard and get the brush out on what we need to do a bit of tidying up on. So let's kind of let's be ambitious, but appropriately modestly ambitious in a way that is realizable. So that's the route map. That's the route map of where we're going. And I should just to translate for those of you who don't do UK English, route is route, okay? And I'm going to use a lot of routes in today's in today's talk. So just keep recalibrating that as route if you need to. So that's the route map. Let's get underway. So section 1 of our 2 big sections, and first of those points, the distinctiveness and limits of receptive ecumenism. As even an initial engagement with the literature suggests, receptive ecumenism is an odd kind of ecumenism. It presupposes and values other kinds of ecumenism, but it neither just repeats them nor reduces to them. Equally, it does not seek to make them redundant either. Receptive ecumenism thinks of the ecumenical endeavor in its entirety. I offer you this image. The ecumenical endeavor in its entirety is a kind of many-stranded rope, composed of multiple strands and cords woven together, which is what gives it its integrity and its strength. Each of these cords having their own important and actually often overlapping roles to play in different contexts and phases of ecumenical interaction. Now, as a consequence, it is indeed possible to identify certain similarities and connections between other forms of ecumenism, between, if you like, the other ecumenical cords and receptive ecumenism, particular ways in which they give some precedent for what receptive ecumenism variously develops. But what I want to suggest is that none of those other forms of developed ecumenism none of those other ecumenical cords are just the same as receptive ecumenism. And looked at in one way, receptive ecumenism can be viewed as proceeding by placing particular strategic emphasis on some basic dispositions that have really always been essential to any real ecumenical progress. And I'm thinking here in particular of the dispositions of humble self-regard and openness to learning from the truth of the other. I mean, no ecumenism worth its name gets going without those dispositions being operating somewhere. But they've tended to operate really kind of in the background as part of the atmosphere in which something else is happening in the foreground. Now, what receptive ecumenism does is that it intentionally focuses in on these dispositions, on this particular cord in the interwoven ecumenical rope. And it draws those dispositions out, draws that cord out, believing that in many contemporary contexts, it's this that now needs to have real priority placed on it. As a way of recognizing this, the precedence of it all, I've sometimes quoted the subtitle of William James's famous lectures on pragmatism and described receptive ecumenism as a new name for some old ways of thinking. And, I think that is kind of true in certain ways, but it's also not the full story. To the extent that there's some truth in it, it also needs complementing by saying that receptive ecumenism is not just a new name for anything whatsoever that sails under the ecumenical flag. In other words, it's not just a new descriptor for whatever we were each already doing. On the one hand, for example, receptive ecumenism presupposes and greatly values the emphasis that life and work ecumenism places on positive relationality and working and being with each other. However, whilst receptive ecumenism views this as essential and really considers it to be of long-term significance, it does not focus on promoting that alone. Receptive ecumenism at its heart wants real growth and change within each of the churches, and not just warmer relationships between the churches. It views each of the different ecclesial traditions as being on a real journey to full communion with each other. I should qualify there, not uniformity, but differentiated communion, real differentiated communion with each other. And receptive ecumenism is committed to that vision of the ecumenical endeavor, no matter how long a journey it's going to be, no matter how long it's going to stretch beyond our lifetime. So whilst presupposing the importance of life and work ecumenism, receptive ecumenism also values and intends to serve the traditional goal of faith and order ecumenism. Equally, on the other hand, whilst receptive ecumenism seeks to serve the traditional goal of faith and order ecumenism, real differentiated communion, it does this neither by seeking to overcome difference through direct convergence or commonality, nor by encouraging the separated churches to reconcile themselves to long-term unresolved difference as the likely permanent state of things. By contrast, receptive ecumenism serves the traditional faith and order goal by looking in the first instance and somewhat counterintuitively, not at the continuing separating differences between traditions, but at the experienced difficulties within respective ecclesial traditions. The focus is on asking how each church, as it walks its own pilgrim way, is being called to growth and conversion. And receptive ecumenism encourages us to pursue this way of growth and conversion, not simply by looking inwardly at our own church's same old logic and same old standard ways of thinking and being, but by asking what we might each fruitfully learn in these regards from the respective gifts of our ecclesial others. I love images. I get through life on images. One of my images here is that of a hamster on a wheel. When we're just working on our own same old logic, we can feel like there's a lot of movement going on, but actually it can just be movement going round and round on the same axis in the same circle and not actually getting anywhere particular. Receptive ecumenism is saying we need to open the windows and let some fresh air in and get some refreshment of our standard logic in a way that might take us forward into Christ and the Spirit. Now, frequently the tendency in ecumenical encounter is the other way round. The tendency can be to see the apparent difficulties in another ecclesial tradition and consider what they might, in our opinion, need to learn from us, all with due modesty, of course. The kind of assumption is that, we're kind of a bit more complete and they're learning from us and becoming more like us. Well, that would really solve their apparent problems and limitations. And boy, it would really take us a bit further, closer together. Well, friends, you might be forgiven, and you really should be forgiven for thinking that that is a game that Catholics have been particularly skilled at playing. And of course, we Catholics have been very skilled at playing that game. But let me suggest, in friendship and love, that it is in fact an attitude that we can all carry within us somewhere. The attitude is that, the others are the kind of problem. No matter how much we love them, the others are the kind of problem. And we know what would fix it if only they would kind of listen to us and get round to realizing just how wonderful and beautiful and graced we are. That's an attitude which I want to suggest, regardless of how much we might seek to suppress it and disguise it when we're actually in the presence of our others and we're being polite. It's an attitude that's operated not just in Catholicism, but it's an attitude that's operated in Baptist tradition, in evangelical life, in the Orthodox churches, and in Pentecostal circles, just as much as within the Catholic psyche. I think perhaps the Catholics have just been very upfront about it. However it is, it's an attitude I want to suggest that basically leads to stasis. In this way of thinking, each is settled, each is protective of what we already have, and not really open to moving and changing. We're open to doing some witness walks together, and we're open to praying together, and we're open to getting on well together. But in terms of real change and move, we tend to be a bit settled. Now, by contrast, whilst receptive ecumenism encourages us to be willing to help our others when we are asked, it does not intentionally focus on our own assumptions about others' perceived needs. That's the kind of key 180 degree switch around that's going on here. Rather, it encourages us to place primary intentional focus on our own difficulties and needs, and the possibilities that are open for fruitfully learning from our ecumenical others. In the hope that by so doing, we might become more fully and freely ourselves, as we're called to be. And that's one of the key things here. This isn't about being open to learning from our others in order to sell out who we are. This is about learning from our others in order to become more who we are. You know, I've been married to my patient and tolerant wife for 32 years. And I like to think I've kind of become more through it, more myself through it, more truly myself. But I've become more truly myself by learning from a fundamentally different person who, boy, can challenge me. So it's this that gives us the language of dynamic integrity that is associated with receptive ecumenism. Dynamism and change, but with integrity. Now, from my own lay Catholic perspective, I sometimes refer to this in terms of becoming more Catholic precisely by becoming more appropriately Baptist, Evangelical, Lutheran, Methodist, Orthodox, Pentecostal, etc. Equally, writing from his own Baptist perspective in his most recent book, Baptists, Catholics, and the Whole Church, Steve Harmon, who I think Steve was going to join us this afternoon, but I can't see all the icons. Steve Harmon expresses it like this: my own ecumenical dream is that to be Baptist or to be Lutheran, Presbyterian or Methodist might come to be regarded as a distinctive way of being Catholic in full communion with the Catholic Church, but without ceasing to be Baptist in ecclesial identity. You know, Steve and I are kind of singing like choristers in harmony, but in different voices. This process of awakening to our need to become more ourselves by learning from our others can come about in two rather different directions. We might, for example, come to realize that we've got a difficulty in our tradition that we can't resolve out of our own existing resources. And that might prompt us to look for fresh resource from without, which might help us to progress. That might sound a bit abstract. Here's a very contemporary example. Pope Francis has opened up a worldwide Catholic synodal process, you know, which isn't the kind of default ethos of the way in which Catholicism has been making decisions and reflecting on things for the past 200 plus years, arguably the past 1,000 years. I mean, it's not that it's alien to our tradition, but it's a bit buried and not very well developed. Now, so what are we going to do with that difficulty? What we might well do with it is ask what we can learn about synodality from you other traditions that have got so much experience in it. So that's one direction in which this might come about, from a sense of need that we can't address ourselves, that we need to look elsewhere. But there's another direction in which it might come about. This is the direction of what I'd call attracted desire, of falling in love, because it might come about because we see and desire something attractive in the other as we get to know our other, in a way that makes us aware of our own relative lack in that regard, okay? So you've got these two complementary ways in which it might kind of get stimulated. Now, as all of this suggests, receptive ecumenism marks a further maturing of the ecumenical process and does actually presuppose and require a certain maturity of ecumenical engagement for it to be feasible, I suggest. On the one hand, it means that we've kind of gotten beyond the stage of prejudiced caricatures and misunderstandings of each other, that we've gotten to know each other relatively well. On the other hand, it means that we've gotten beyond formalities as well. The formality of always feeling the need to show our idealized best sides to each other, and have gotten instead to feeling able to be more honest with each other concerning the real state of things within each of our traditions, warts and all. I mean, to really love somebody is not to love them as an ideal on a mantelpiece, It's to love them as they are. To really love our own ecclesial belonging is not to need to kind of say how it's, perfect in every way, but to love it as it is, as the earthen vessel that can still be minister of grace. And to love our other is to show ourselves to our other, not as that perfect piece in the mind, but as the earthen vessels we are, but that are nevertheless ministers of grace. I think it also marks the multiple humblings of the churches, as we've been forced, whether we like it or not, to take a long, hard look at ourselves, so that it actually has become rather difficult to just present the idealized portrait. I mean, something like the sexual abuse crisis, as that has variously manifested in each of our traditions, really requires us to get a bit more real about ourselves. So this gives us, I think, the image of receptive ecumenism as an ecumenism of the wounded hands. We show our wounded hands to the other in the hope that the other can minister to us from their strengths. That's another key image at work in receptive ecumenism. And as earlier alluded to, there is both need and desire here, recognized difficulty and hoped for possibility. Of course, as I've acknowledged, the attitudes of humble self-criticism, of openness to learning and receiving from the other, and of commitment to walking the way of ecclesial conversion, have always been present in ecumenical engagement at its best. What receptive ecumenism does, as I've said, is to take these attitudes and commitments from the realm of background context and to bring them right to the foreground in an explicit programmatic fashion. To return to our earlier image, amongst the interwoven cords of the ecumenical rope, these attitudes were always there as part of the essential binding, but they were not particularly noticeable as a distinctive strand. By contrast, given both the maturing of much ecumenical engagement and the fact of new substantive differences arising on which convergence can't be directly achieved, receptive ecumenism is saying that it is now both possible and necessary, possible because of the maturing, necessary because of the significant obstacles, possible and necessary to draw this strand out and to put it to work in service of the growth of each of the churches through transformative ecumenical learning. The conviction is that this growth of each of the churches through receptive ecumenical learning will in turn open greater, as yet unforeseeable possibilities for the healing of the divisions between the churches. So receptive ecumenical learning is here viewed as the key both to the healing of the respective wounds within our churches, and thereby in time to the healing of the wounds between the churches. It's not a settling for something less, it's a moving forwards. And any of you who are runners, go and run at the horizon and you'll find it just keeps opening up before you. It doesn't close down. Along with placing strategic priority on this particular chord within the overall ecumenical rope, on the grounds that it's particularly well fitted to many contemporary ecumenical contexts, what receptive ecumenism also advocates is the need for this to be done in a disciplined, systematic fashion. It's not just a kind of pick and mix and anything goes. The point, as noted, is that any potential learning from the other needs to be done with dynamic integrity maintained. Hence, it needs to be properly tested. Once a felt need within one tradition and a potential relevant learning opportunity from another tradition has been identified, this required process of testing for dynamic integrity can be thought of as operating on three interrelated levels in accordance with three questions. And these questions are, firstly, where are the points of existing resonance within the host tradition, within the learning tradition, which makes it possible for the proposed creative reception to begin to be explored? In the synodality example, where's the roots of synodality, albeit them now somewhat submerged and lost from memory in Catholic practice and tradition? Secondly, Where are the points of difficulty, difference, and tension within the host tradition, the learning tradition in this regard, which mean that some reconfiguring of the host tradition will be required if this proposed creative reception is actually to be performed and achieved. To stick with the synodality example in Catholicism, you know, we've operated a fairly unilateral hierarchical approach to discernment and decision making. How is that? How is what is important at the heart of that going to marry up with this approach to synodality? Thirdly, how can such reconfiguring be done with dynamic integrity maintained? And I guess in those questions, we're indicating where some of the theological, more formal theological work needs to be done in the receptive ecumenical process. Not everyone can be involved in receptive ecumenism. Not everyone who is involved needs to be a theologian, but there does need to be theological involvement in various ways at various points. Now, even when the proposed learning is of a very practical nature, and it can be, say, concerning what we might learn from each other about mission strategy or practices of discernment, you know, it doesn't need to be big formal theological stuff. But even when it is of that more practical nature, I suggest that this threefold moment of theological testing needs in some appropriate way to be incorporated as an essential part of the distinctive way of receptive ecumenism. And turning all this back to ourselves, the key personal questions this all leaves us with, and I'm going to keep repeating these at various points, that this all leaves us with after we've had that bit of an initial trip through the thinking behind receptive ecumenism. Well, two questions. One as to whether the particular ecumenical contexts in which you are each respectively engaged lend themselves in any way to a receptive ecumenical approach. And secondly, if so, what that might look like in practice. Now, before turning a little more closely towards those practical questions in the second half of our session, what I want to do now, having explored receptive ecumenism and some of the basic orientations of thought, I now want to, in a sense, revisit some of those points, but in a more explicitly pneumatological voice and pneumatological frame. And I want to explore the way in which receptive ecumenism can be well thought of as a movement of the spirit, and the ways in which it's shaped by a number of particular pneumatological convictions and commitments. Now, I can see just on the small screen I've got, there's about 5 other screens of icons, living icons to meet, but I can see some wonderful long-term friends here. Mary Reith, it's lovely to see you, Mary, and I'm sure there's many others. Bill Offler from down the road in Darlington here in the UK. So I know for a fact that much of what I've just been exploring will kind of be old hat to some of you. I hope even when it's kind of old hat, I've been spinning it in a way that brings some fresh strands out, and I hope it's been accessible enough for those who are jumping on for the first time. What I'm now going to do is, whilst it's been there as part of the background of receptive ecumenical reflection for a long time, all this pneumatological stuff, which is very important to me, I'm actually teasing this out, I think, for the first time in one of the presentations. So if you've been in danger of going into snooze control for the last 15 minutes or so, you know, it might be worth giving me giving another kind of bit of time to it for the next few minutes. But I guarantee 10 minutes, and you'll be free of this voice droning on, and you'll get to have some Q&A for a while. Okay, are we okay with this still, Nathan?
Yes, of course. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks. So speaking personally in the first instance, and a lot more could be said about this, but we need to be brief. From the point of its emergence into focused view and explicit articulation in the context of some teaching that I was required to do, and that's the appropriate verb, I was required to do some teaching in ecumenical theology. I'd never done it before. And it was in an ecumenical seminarian context. I'd never taught ecclesiology before. It scared the pants off me. but it rapidly became a really important thing to me, and it had something of the quality of a movement of the spirit about it, the way in which receptive ecumenism emerged into focus. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, well, firstly, it was neither personally planned for, nor previously in view. With that, it had the feel of being a real, when the kind of the penny dropped, and I kind of went from seeing this, oh gosh, I've got this cause, it's a real problem, and became excited with a possibility. It had this feel of being a realization, like an epiphany, a happening that came as well fitted to a context of uninvited challenge. I was focused on, gosh, this is something I'm being required to do and I'm not feeling comfortable with it. And this came as well fitted. It brought lightness, freshness, depth, and open new possibilities. You know, there seemed to be something of the signs of the Spirit's presence. For all, again, this is interesting, for all its sense of breakthrough freshness, when viewed retrospectively, it can be seen actually to well fit into a pattern, both of prior preparation in practical terms and intellectual terms in my own life and work, and also fit into a pattern of significant earlier anticipations in the life and work of others. And perhaps most confirming of all, and indicative of what I would refer to as the synchronicity of the Spirit, was the echo, the resonance and recognition it found in the hearts and minds of many others, in many and diverse ecclesial contexts and traditions. Taken together, all of this is suggestive to me of the prior initiating, drawing role of the Spirit in all good things. Suggestive to me of the way in which our own moving is held within the prior and continuing movement of the Spirit. And in this, I think our appropriate prayer might be, Lord, Holy Spirit, move our desire that we might more desire your moving of us. Now, of course, in an important sense, there's nothing that surprising about the fact of the ecumenical movement and the emergence into view of a specifically receptive ecumenical expression of that movement being experienced as being drawn out by and held within this initiating, transforming movement of the Spirit. Because the point is that in Christian understanding, even within the very life of God, the Spirit is that which holds diversity in communion for mutual flourishing. And so the work of the Spirit in creation and in the economy of salvation as the overflow of God's life, which is how I think we need to well understand creation. It's the work of the Spirit in the economy of salvation in creation is necessarily going to reflect the nature, the identity of the Spirit as that which holds diversity and communion for multiple flourishing. In short, ecumenism is the no-brainer for the Spirit. Again, Christian existence, let's kind of move register slightly, but staying with this. Christian existence, life in the Spirit. Well, it is by definition a living between the times, a living in the Spirit, between the definitive showing and performing of God's ways with the world, in the Spirit-filled life of Jesus, which is the Spirit, who is the Spirit-wrought incarnate Word, and the final living between that definitive showing and performing, and the final consummation of all of that, the consummation of those ways of God, in the all in all of the risen and ascended cosmic Christ. You know, Christian existence, let's remind ourselves of some of the basics. Christian existence is not, first and foremost, either an ethical code or a set of beliefs. It's not a work that we achieve, nor a philosophy that we fashion. Most fundamentally, Christian existence, life in the Spirit, is a matter of Spirit-filled participation in and Spirit-wrought conformity to the Spirit-filled communion that Jesus enjoyed with God, who he knew as Abba, and of Spirit-filled participation in and Spirit-wrought conformity to the life that flowed from that communion. Well, so also, receptive ecumenism is a living between the times in the Spirit, a living between the emergence of the modern ecumenical movement with its hope for a united church and united Christian witness, and the fulfillment of that hope, which can seem like it will forever elude us, or it seem at times like it will forever elude us. And poised between these times, receptive ecumenism is a Spirit-moved living in anticipation now and a real moving towards the consummation of the all in all its diversity and particularity, in the magnificently complex and all-encompassing simplicity of God in Christ and the Spirit. So receptive ecumenism neither settles for cooperation in matters of life and work and accommodation to long-term unreconciled diversity as all that is achievable, nor does it view the achievement of fully reconciled Christian communion as a programmable goal attainable purely by human will and exertion. Receptive ecumenism is a way of leaning into and living out of the Spirit in the here and now. You remember as children being able to play with a strong wind on a windy day and being able to lean yourself into it and be held by it and stood up. Receptive ecumenism is a way of leaning into the Spirit, which I think is a fundamental image for what Christian life really exists in. It's a way of doing today what is before us and what has the capacity to disclose and take us toward that to which we are called. It's about living in the here and now. It's a Spirit-moved third way of living in the moment, oriented towards the unfathomable whole. Rather than ending in paralyzed stasis, overwhelmed by an ungraspable totality, receptive ecumenism recognizes that Christian existence between the times is not about the achieving of infinity or totality, but simply about living the particular parts that are ours to live in the here and now, in the light of what has been disclosed to us of that infinity and totality. Each of our respective nows, each of our respective presents is of irreducible significance in the hair on the head world in which we exist. Not because that's all we have, but because that is where the spirit of the eschaton, the spirit of our future, our arrabone, our pledge and down payment, our foretaste, that is where that spirit is really present to us. Because that is where we are each being called, and the only place where our response can be made, the only place where we can each grow further into the fullness of Christ. The dynamic liquidity of the Spirit. I love that notion, the liquidity of the Spirit's capacity for opening ways ahead where none seem possible, for getting in where nothing else can in the way that water can. The Spirit's capacity for this is evident in receptive ecumenism's turn from focusing directly, for now, not forever, but for now, turning from focusing directly for now on matters of seemingly irreconcilable and communion dividing difference between traditions, to inviting each tradition, each ecclesial community, to examine what's frustrated, stunted, and unhelpfully and unnecessarily limited within its own experience. The conviction is that as each tradition, each ecclesial community experiences the healing of its own wounds, something of the healing of its own wounds, through the grace of the Spirit mediated by other traditions, other ecclesial communities, well, so the relationship between the divided communities will alter and fresh possibilities currently unforeseeable will emerge. The thing is, we don't need to worry overly about tomorrow. We don't need to worry overly about the future or about what seems impossible today. What we need to do is to focus on what is possible and necessary today. And with constant prayerful dependence on the Spirit, to focus on responding generously, creatively, and courageously to the particular way in which we are being called to move and walk at this point. By doing what is before us today, more will become possible tomorrow. In play here is a pneumatological understanding of Christian tradition. The Spirit-led vitality to Christian life is such that responsibility for the authenticity of our respective ecclesial traditions simply cannot be reduced to a concern for the steadfast, identical repetition of received articulations and performances. Rather, it needs to focus in a preparedness to keep returning to our respective core callings and to keep asking what fresh articulations and performances of these are now appropriate with dynamic integrity to the specific challenges and opportunities of our times and callings. The Spirit, the initiating, transforming action of God, is the one who brings the word to ever fresh articulation and performance. The one who brings Christ to life and presence ever afresh in the practice of the church. In this evermore of the Spirit, each is being called to grow in our respective ecclesial presence and showing of Christ by receiving of and learning from the real presences and showings of Christ in our others, so that we can more fully recognize that presence in each other, and together the better manifest and bear witness to it for the salvation of the world.